without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Susan Hyman. Susan Hyman is a developmental and behavioral pediatrician. She is also a professor of pediatrics at the Golisano Children's Hospital at the University of Rochester. She sees children and young adults with autism through the Levine Autism Clinic, where her clinical research focuses on diet and nutrition, medical care, and interventions related to autism. She is on the executive committee of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Children with Disabilities and the subboard of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics of the American Board of Pediatrics. She is a co-principal investigator at the Rochester site of the Autism Speaks Autism Treatment Network. It's our extreme pleasure to have Dr. Hyman with us today. So without further ado, please take it away.
So thank you. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon on the East Coast. And we'll be talking for the next hour about diet and autism spectrum disorders. I'd like to start by disclosing my other funding, trials that I'm involved with, research that I'm involved with, and I also want to disclose to you that I have bribed my own children to eat vegetables. So those of you of an age remember the phrase, "you are what you eat." In the 1960s, this was the buzzword for the movement for organic food and for macrobiotic diets, but its origins are much older than that. In the 1920s and 30s, there was a physician who really was purporting healthy eating and diet as a means for improving wellness. And if you ask the question, "you are what you eat," to any of my families, many of the patients that I serve, the question would be, if my children were what they ate, they would be chicken nuggets, cheese crackers, chips, pretzels, or air. My own personal son would be macaroni and cheese. So with that as a multiple choice question, I set up a series of questions that I'd like to address over the next 45 minutes or so before we get to your questions and answers. The topics we will cover are food selectivity and autism spectrum disorders. Why are people, not just children with autism, selective in what they eat? What are the implications of this food selectivity in terms of their general nutritional status and wellness? How does general nutrition and the nutrition of children and adults with autism impact behavior and other aspects of health? And we'll talk about the evidence for dietary treatments for symptoms of autism. I will not cover specifically how to implement dietary treatments, but I certainly can answer questions that you have in a general fashion. So first, from looking at your surveys, I think that we were all bobblehead dolls. Yes, yes, yes. Mealtime challenges are common. Food selectivity and eating problems are reported extraordinarily frequently in children. Most of the research is done in children with autism. And not only are food selectivity and refusal common, as your survey pointed out, but disruptive mealtime behaviors. When you don't want the food that's offered to you, what do you do that registers that to your family is really a common presenting problem to feeding clinics and really is very disruptive to families. Food selectivity is probably not all environmentally supported or induced. That toddlers, even before the diagnosis of autism, are identified as having feeding problems. In a large study, a longitudinal study that was done in the UK that followed thousands and thousands of pregnancies and young children through childhood, they found that in the small group of children who were later diagnosed with autism out of this large cohort, that the children who had autism were slower feeders in the first year of life and had much more significant food selectivity, were picky by 15 months of age, long before most of them were ever even thought of having autism spectrum disorder. One of the things that many of you probably live with on a day-to-day basis is the food selectivity is not limited to early childhood. There's increasing recognition that food selectivity in people with autism persists through adolescence into adulthood, may have long-ranging health implications, and is truly an understudied area. Now, picky eating is common in all children, not just children with autism. And I just want to point that out because much of what we know about dietary insufficiency comes from the general pediatric literature and general medical literature, and people with autism are people first and foremost. So we know that less than 1/3 of all young children are never perceived as picky eaters. And about 1/4 of children have persistent pickiness as part of their parents' concerns. However, as your survey demonstrated earlier, children with autism are much more likely to eat fewer foods. NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition survey that the government does in an ongoing fashion, looks at the diet of Americans across the age span. And the lower 5th percentile of food variety are people that eat 50 foods, and people with autism are overrepresented in that group, so 50 foods total. And many families that I work with can count on the fingers of each hand how many foods their family members will eat. People who have looked at the way that children with autism are selective compared to other children have identified that the selectivity is more likely to be on the basis of texture, mushy or crunchy, for example, taste and smell, food being mixed together, and shape, but are similar to other children related to temperature, having the food touch each other on your plate, or color. And the last comment was actually sort of surprising to me. As you know, you hear about families will say, oh, my child is on the white diet or on the orange diet. And color actually is something that's common, apparently, across populations. So why are people with autism picky? That's where the wherefore comes in. For what reason? So food selectivity may be potentiated on the basis of obsession and perseverative interest. This may reflect things like texture, temperature, color, brand. The individual who will only eat French fries from one fast food restaurant based on the packaging, for example. Is that an obsession? Are there true sensory differences that impact the way one tastes or smells food, or the mouth feel of food, how food feels in your mouth? Is there perseveration related to routine, how food is presented? And lastly, the idea of having a true anxiety disorder, a food neophobia, anxiety with newer specific foods, is something that has been described in the general population, and is probably true for people with autism as well, because there are so many biologic predispositions for anxiety. The disruptive behavior around mealtime that we talked about earlier may be more dramatic and may have to do with food refusal for the above reasons, and disruptive mealtime behaviors that may be a pattern of other disruptive behaviors that may occur for a communicative or other purpose. Sensory differences are something that has gotten increasing scientific attention, especially since the DSM-5 in 2013 included sensory differences as part of the diagnostic criteria. And people with autism may be sensitive to variation in taste or flavor. Again, it may be a perseveration, but there is increasing work looking at the genes that are involved in taste. And I put up as an example the proper PTC tasting. For those of you who went to high school in New York State any time in the past century, you all did the same lab of identifying the genetic tasters versus not tasters of bitter taste using strips on your tongue, where if you have 2 of the taste genes, you're a super taster and it tastes very bitter to you. If you have 2 recessive genes, you can't taste it at all. And people who have one dominant, one recessive gene, you have varying degrees of in between. And this is how in New York State they've studied genetics in high school forever. But it actually it's more than just a party trick, that we do have taste genes. And people who are super tasters find vegetables that are cruciferous, like cabbage and Brussels sprouts, to be unpleasant, and may be more likely to refuse vegetables. They may be more likely to find alcohol to be distasteful. But I think that for the purposes of thinking about true sensory differences in autism, there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done with understanding why we sense things differently and how this may underlie what we see currently as behaviors. In one study that Cindy Johnson did on the Autism Treatment Network data, she looked at an inventory of mealtime behavior in 250 some odd children with autism, and found that parents who rated feeding behavior more poorly also reported more sensory symptoms, reported increased rates of other repetitive behaviors, and the children ate less well. And that's no surprise to any of you. What most of you know is that with the DSM-5, you can make multiple diagnoses simultaneously. So in addition to autism, you can have what's known as an avoidant restrictive feeding disorder. This is not anorexia. This is not bulimia. There are no body image issues. But this is a persistent failure to meet the nutritional or energy needs. And you see the criteria on your screen now. And I bolded the marked interference with social functioning, so that many people with autism will also have an avoidant restrictive feeding disorder that may complicate or in other ways increase the severity of the symptoms that they experience related to their autism. We're not talking specifically about the treatment of food selectivity, and if it were so easy to just go to a toolkit and fix these symptoms, I wouldn't have 12 psychologists in my division who treat feeding behavior. However, there is a toolkit on the Autism Treatment Network website that frames some of the issues that may need to be addressed. And I think that one of the things that many of you have experienced is that you can give your child, or you yourself can experience repetition and exposure to different foods. And most of us, after 3 to 5 exposures, will not give our child, how many times can you stand to have Brussels sprouts on the floor? But it can take dozens of times before it becomes familiar and food would be accepted. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, okay, people with autism have food selectivity. It may be based in part in anxiety, in part in perseveration, in part in sensory symptoms. What does it mean in terms of health and wellness, and what does it mean across the lifespan? This is just, again, to remind us that people with autism are people, and that typical Americans have a pretty crummy diet. This is national data, and I just put this up to show you that we as a population don't eat enough healthy food. We don't eat enough fiber. We don't eat enough potassium. We certainly don't eat enough vitamin D. And we eat too many solid fats and added sugars, too many refined grains, and much more sodium than we evolutionarily were designed to eat. So this is to put it in perspective. And I also want to lead off with a health and wellness issue that isn't what you expected, which was dietary deficiency, but that people who are selective eaters may also eat too much of calorie-dense, nutrition-poor foods. And this is something that we have to be excruciatingly aware of, both in early childhood to prevent and in adulthood to manage. And obesity in people with autism may be related to food selectivity, may in part be related to fewer opportunities for active leisure, may in part be related to medicines that are used that have obesity and increased appetite as a side effect, and certainly to genetic factors that may lead to overgrowth. I put this in the slides for your reading pleasure. One of the questions that we would have for someone who was reporting food insufficient diet is, what volumes do you eat? And I think that we in America have this delusion of how much food is a normal portion. You know, what supersized has become normal to us. So we have to remember what typical serving sizes are. And again, putting in perspective of what we know about general health and wellness when we think about people with autism. So people with autism do have selective diets, and we are concerned about nutritional deficiencies, even though calorie deficiency is not typical. Will Sharp and his colleagues looked at the children that entered their clinical treatment program, and they found that a large majority of the kids ate virtually no vegetables. Many ate no fruit. And when you look at eliminating entire food groups, you really have pretty high risk, so that thinking about what deficiencies may be present is really critically important when you're thinking about health, wellness, and how diet affects behavior. And I just want to point out that these individuals were all referred for feeding problems, but that poor growth was not one of their presenting concerns. This is a food record, and some of you who've heard me speak before may have seen this, because this is the chicken nugget and cheese cracker diet. And when you look at the food selectivity that Will and his colleagues had commented on, this is a pretty limited diet. This is a child that eats crackers, some oatmeal, a little bit of milk, gets a vitamin D supplement, has some applesauce, but mostly drinks water. And this is a food analysis of this child's diet. And if I can just walk you through this, this is using a research level program that we've used in some of our studies called NDSR, that the dietitian analyzed for 3 days of this diet that was extraordinarily repetitive. That, as most of you know, people with autism will eat the same thing every day, or close to it. And with this chicken nugget and cheese cracker diet, you see all the bars in green, which are foods that the nutrients that are sufficient, that are adequate. You see the bars in red, which are the nutrients that this diet provided too much of, and the bars in yellow are the things that are deficient. And looking at how limited that diet is, it's pretty amazing the few number of nutrients that are in the yellow. The diet without supplementation was remarkably deficient in vitamin D, deficient in fiber, deficient in choline, deficient in potassium, and had too much manganese, folate, because grain products are supplemented with folate, and sodium. And what this points out is that in the American and Canadian diet, that our foods are so highly fortified that what looks like a deficient diet may actually be okay. And having a dietitian who can look at the ingredients, and it's a product by product difference, that 2 different brands of cheese crackers, for example, may have different nutritional value. And, for those of you who are eating your lunches at your desk during this webinar, look at the label of your granola bar and, in what part of nature the oat products have calcium. These are highly fortified products. So that the American diet has changed substantially because of our commercial desire to fortify. We're going to come back to that. So because people with autism have very selective diets, it's a common problem. There have been a number of research groups who've looked at the nutritional intake, mostly of children, with autism, and the research data varies somewhat based on the way that the studies have been done and the populations that have been looked at. The studies, some of them include what's called a 3-day diet recall, where people write down everything that an individual eats for 3 days. There have been studies that have done that for a week. 3 days is probably as good as a week according to research literature. 24-hour recall is a snapshot of what people eat. And then some studies are done using a food frequency record, which is a way to get an estimate of what the diet would include based on the types of foods that are eaten. The analysis software differs somewhat in terms of the completeness, because there is brand-to-brand variation. And also, one of the things that varies from study to study is the definitions of what adequate diets are. Consistent findings across the studies include low intake of vitamin D, low intake of calcium, low intake of fiber, and this is very much like other children in America. Adequate energy intake, which means plenty of calories. When compared to control groups, the control groups are sometimes siblings who live in the same households, have the same cultural availability of food. Sometimes are compared to other children with disabilities and other children with typical development. And when compared to siblings, the children with autism have relatively similar nutrition. They have less variety than other children that are studied, and do have, in some studies, more deficiencies. The studies across the U.S. and including international studies differ in their reports of the intake of iron, zinc, vitamin C, vitamin A, B12, vitamin K. And some of this reflects, many of the studies are international, that people who were studied in Spain who are eating a Mediterranean diet are going to have more legumes and more vegetable products, less fortified products than in the U.S. Children in China, for example, have a different availability and fewer fortified products. So most of my comments are limited to studies that are done in the U.S. and Canada. We did a study several years ago looking at the dietary intake and food-related behaviors in children who were enrolled in the Autism Treatment Network across 5 sites. We were interested in the geographic regions, so one of the sites was in the south, one was in the west, a couple in the east. And of 292 children of whom we had data, we found that these children who were 2 to 11 years of age ate less potassium, ate less fiber, less vitamin D, vitamin E, calcium. And the thing that was striking is that they were really very similar to, in their pattern of deficiencies, to children in America in general. And this is important to remember, that with the fortification of the food supply, all of our children are at risk for these dietary deficiencies, not just our children and us, not just people with and without with autism. I'd like to introduce a couple of definitions. There will not be a quiz, but when I mentioned earlier that the studies differ somewhat in how they decide a diet is sufficient, that all of these values are compared to the dietary reference intake, which is developed by the Food and Nutrition Board at the Institute of Medicine in Washington. The RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, is the average daily level of intake sufficient to meet the nutrient requirements of almost everybody. So if you're going to eat the RDA, that's more than what many people need. But the RDA is what some studies compare to. Adequate intake is the amount that's assumed to ensure nutritional adequacy that that has been stated by a panel of experts when we don't have actual research data to tell us what the RDA is. The estimated average requirement is the average daily level of intake estimated to meet the requirements of half of healthy people. And the tolerable upper intake level is the maximum daily level unlikely to cause adverse health effects. And this is an important concept because the American food supply is the largest unregulated experiment, I think, in history, that we are eating levels of fortified nutrients that really exceed what would be found in nature. Eating naturally occurring nutrients, your body usually can self-regulate, but it's this fortification and taking extra vitamins and nutrients that may also cause problems. So it's undernutrition and overnutrition we need to be aware of. So why did I give you all these definitions? Because I have some graphs I'll be showing you of the nutrients with EARs and nutrients with AIs. So here are children from the ATN Diet and Nutrition Study, and these bars, white is for non-supplement users, gray are for supplement users from diet alone, and the dark colored bar is for supplement users, supplement plus diet. And these are the individuals with intake below the EAR. So the higher the bars, the more likely you are to be deficient. So you can see that in the youngest children, we can get calcium into these children with autism, but as they get older, they're less and less likely to drink milk and have dairy products that are adequate to meet their calcium needs, and they certainly aren't meeting their vitamin D needs. And this is very similar to other children in America. And what you also saw in this is that when you supplement, the bars get lower, which means you're getting closer to where you need to be, but we don't supplement enough. And these are two nutrients that are measured using adequate intake. And what you can see here is with this metric, the closer to zero is very few people are taking enough potassium, and very few are taking enough choline through diet or supplements, and we wouldn't supplement with potassium. So we've talked about general diet and general selectivity, but there certainly are deficiency disorders that are reported in children with autism, and we worry about. So I'm reassuring you that on the cheese cracker and chicken nugget diet, that most kids do okay in most nutrients, but there are people who have such severe selectivity that deficiency disorders can occur. And for those of us who care for children with autism or live with children with autism or work with adults with autism, we really need to be aware of these deficiency disorders that many people in modern medicine just don't think about. And the one that I'd like to highlight first is vitamin D deficiency in rickets. That gives you weak bones, you get abnormalities in bone pain, and that certainly is reported. And I live in upstate New York where we don't have sun for several months of the year. I won't tell you how many. And sunshine is one of the ways you get vitamin D in your body. And we do see patients with rickets. Vitamin C deficiency, many of you think, well, scurvy, that's only something that British sailors got in the 1800s before they discovered that citrus fruit would prevent it. Well, we do see patients who have scurvy, who have severely limited diets. And there have been several case reports in the literature recently of individuals with autism who presented with pain, skin lesions, and irritability related to scurvy. And we actually have had patients here in our institution. This is a picture of you get bleeding and dental gingival gum hyperplasia, so that people who may be seeing symptoms of scurvy may be, for example, orthopedists with bone pain or dentists. With vitamin K deficiency, there have been reports of bleeding. Vitamin A deficiency, you get a thickening of the lining of the eye. So that's been reported in autism. There have been a couple of recent reports of people with autism and developmental disabilities who have hypothyroidism on the basis of iodine deficiency. And on this next slide, I include some top sources of specific nutrients that may be deficient in these disorders, so you can see how this could happen in people with severe selectivity. Vitamin D is found in dairy products, in margarine, some breakfast cereals, fatty fish, and of course sunshine. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important, if you're modifying your diet for therapeutic attempt, to substitute with a product that has vitamin D and has calcium, but the vitamin D deficiency is what results in rickets. Vitamin C is found in fruits, in tomatoes, potato skin. Lots of different fruits have some vitamin C, and it's also highly fortified. For those of you who want to look at your breakfast bar wrapper, it might have vitamin C, so that it's being put in lots of different foods. Vitamin A is fortified in dairy products, so people who are not taking dairy products may have insufficient vitamin A. It's found in liver. I've yet to come across a patient who will eat liver, but in some fortified breakfast cereals. Vitamin K is found in leafy greens and certain oils. And iodine is found in dairy and grain products because of both the feed of the animals and the way that the products are produced. Iodized salt has iodine. That's something that in America and in the U.S. and in Canada, most salt is iodized. People who are using specialty salts and gourmet salts may not have iodized salt. So it's something you really need to pay attention to. Seafood and seaweed are good sources of iodine. So you can see when you think about the food selectivity, you can see how you can run into pretty severe problems in isolated cases. So to move on to my third segment, which is, okay, I talked about these severe deficiencies, but what is the real relationship of nutrition and behavior, and what does that mean for autism spectrum disorders? This is an ad from the early 1930s, which talks about food really does impact your sense of wellness. In this case, it was an advertisement how yeast could improve virtually anything that's wrong with you. And I'm not suggesting that you should add yeast to your diet to treat anything. However, I do want to use two examples that we don't have to stray beyond what we know about nutrition science to think about how diet affects behavior and health. The first is iron deficiency. As I pointed out earlier, in our Autism Treatment Network study, we did not find insufficient iron intake in most children. However, other studies have looked specifically at iron, and there are other studies that suggest that children, and again, these studies are all done in children, may have insufficient iron intake. In our Autism Treatment Network study, Ann Reynolds in Colorado looked at the ferritin level, which is a building block of iron, and found that despite adequate intake, that the patients on whom we had these levels had slightly lower ferritin levels. The data remains inconclusive, but we know that many of the iron-containing foods are things that people with autism don't eat. Iron, the building blocks of iron are present in lean meat and seafood. Non-heme iron, so a different biochemical form of iron, is present in nuts and beans and fortified grain products. Wheat flour is fortified with iron in the U.S., so gluten-free products may not be fortified. And one of the things that we don't know is the absorption of non-heme iron, so that if you have your major source of iron as fortified breakfast cereal, which is common for toddlers in the U.S. We really don't know a lot about the bioavailability of that. We know that iron supplementation really is common when we identify low iron stores, and that for any of you who've taken iron, you know that you can get constipation, you can get some GI distress, so that many people who are iron deficient give up and don't look for other ways to take it or ways to make it more tolerable. We know biochemically that iron is necessary for synthesis of at least two neurotransmitters in the brain that are important for different behaviors that are relevant in autism. And we also know that deficiency of iron in infancy may have long-term effects, that the impact may be many years after the deficiency is corrected. Studies done looking at iron deficiency in children without autism have identified that low iron stores, not necessarily anemia, can be associated with inattention, decreased inhibition, poor memory, irritability, motor delays, can be associated with anxiety and depression later in life. And toddlers who have had their iron deficiency corrected can continue to be wary in novel situations. So that these studies have not been replicated in individuals with autism, but certainly these are symptoms that if you could manage even a little bit with a better diet, certainly would be something that would be attractive for all of us. Something that has been looked at is restless leg syndrome and night waking, that there's increasing awareness that low iron stores, but not anemia, may result in night waking and a feeling of restlessness, so that for those of you who have problems with sustaining sleep at night, that insufficient iron may be in part related, and that's why when you see the sleep specialist, they supplement you with iron and vitamin C. So iron is one example of a nutrient that we know a lot about that may impact behavior, hasn't been studied in autism, but is important. Vitamin D is the second nutrient that I'd like to highlight. This slide just reminds us that the only real indication for vitamin D supplementation right now is bone health. And we know that individuals with autism have been studied related to bone mineral density, and the jury is still out. However, what appears to be is that bone mineral density in children boys 8 through 17 seems to be associated with lower protein intake and less activity, because being active helps you with bone thickness. Vitamin D does other things, and there's a tremendous amount of controversy. So I put iron up as something that we know a lot about iron, and these are true facts about iron. What we don't know about vitamin D, however, is what else it might do. And these are two relatively controversial studies that I put up for discussion's sake. One is a case report of a preschooler in China who had low vitamin D at the time of diagnosis, was provided vitamin D supplementation as well as intervention and made improvement. And I just want to remind you that intervention is associated with improvement, not just nutrition. And the other is a randomized controlled trial that was done in Cairo, where they looked at a number of measures related to behavior during 4 months of vitamin D therapy. There are some statistical problems with this study. I'm not suggesting that vitamin D will improve irritability and stereotype behavior, but there's a lot we don't know, and that further studies clearly need to be done. Here are some references on general nutrition. I just want to point out that your grandmother was correct, and that we do have data that breakfast improves attention. And just to remind you that foods in the U.S. are highly fortified, so that an adequate diet may look different than a balanced diet. And it's important to have a dietitian on your team if you have a severely limited diet that you're working with. So the last set of topics I want to bring up have to do with dietary interventions. So we talked about selective diet, we talked about dietary sequelae with limitation, and this is really building up to the idea that, well, if people with autism self-limit, they report GI symptoms, can you alter diet to treat the autism? And there have been a lot of hypotheses that were generated, and there certainly is ongoing research looking at why this might be, but we're really at the level of empiric observation. And the first diet that I want to comment on is the empiric observation that people had is if when eliminating milk and wheat products, milk and gluten-containing products, barley, rye, oats, and wheat, could you make a difference? This was observed years ago, and there have been a number of studies that you see summarized on this slide without any real documentation in a scientifically rigorous fashion that elimination of gluten or casein impacts the outcome in autism. There have been a number of studies that have been single-blind or open trials, and if you modify diet and then ask the people who've modified the diet, does it improve, there's a lot of bias. So it's very hard to interpret these studies. We did a study which was a challenge study where we took a number of children, put them on a very rigorous gluten and casein-free diet, and then challenged them with gluten and casein, or placebo, and then looked at an array of behaviors in an objective fashion. We looked at sleep, we looked at stool pattern and consistency, we looked at hyperactivity using an actometer, which is a little device that measures activity. We did a test looking at social reciprocity, and we found no difference with any of these challenges. But what I want to just say about our study, however, is we controlled for other interventions that all of these children were receiving ABA. And one of the things that all of you who work with autism and live with autism know is that other interventions going on simultaneously are confounds or can impact your interpretation. So these studies are hard to do. It is not inconceivable that removing gluten may improve GI symptoms in people who have celiac disease or gluten intolerance, and it's not inconceivable that taking away milk might improve irritability in people with lactose intolerance. But I think that every person is an experiment until the data is complete, and you have to be open-minded both ways. Many of my colleagues in medicine say, well, this is a dangerous diet. And from looking at the information that I shared with you about children in general, that I would like to say that as long as you're attentive to what you are feeding your child or what you are eating, that the gluten and casein-free diet can be done safely. And this is a picture of nutrients. Again, these are in children. On the left of each bar are not on the GFCF diet. On the right of each box are on the diet, and the height above 0 are the people who are insufficient. And what you see, the white box are non-supplement users, gray box are supplement users, and the dark-colored box is diet plus supplement. And what you can see is that the children who are on the GFCF diet, really their calcium and vitamin D intake is really not a lot different from the children who aren't on the diet. and maybe a little bit better in terms of vitamin D because their parents are supplementing better. What you see is that the children who are not on the GFCF diet are more likely to be deficient in vitamin E, and that may be in part because of the nut-based and soy-based products that the GFCF children were eating. This was also found in Spain on a Mediterranean diet, that children given a GFCF diet needed vitamin D supplementation. And I also just remind us again that there is cultural variation. What about other dietary interventions? There's been a fair amount of press recently about the ketogenic diet and the modified Atkins diet. Again, pretty controversial because this is a diet that is largely fat, and in terms of long-term wellness, may be a problem. It's not a diet that's particularly palatable, and if anyone is thinking of trying this, I would highly urge a registered dietitian to be involved because of the real potential for nutritional deficiency. But the ketogenic diet is effective for seizure management, and many of you may have experience in that regard. One of my sort of pet peeves are, well, you know, when you're messing with diet, you're messing with lots of things. And if you are giving gluten-free foods, you're also giving foods that are not as highly fortified and may not have food additives or food coloring. There was a lot of press in the early 60s about the potential relationship of artificial food colorings and activity. In the UK and in Canada, you cannot put artificial food colorings in the food supply. That's why these candies on this slide look different than the candies that you'll see in the US. And the jury is still out whether artificial food coloring actually may worsen inattention and hyperactivity. And I have not yet formed an opinion on that. So at this point, there's little evidence to support the use of nutritional supplements or dietary therapies when you look at the data. So when you look at the hard research, these are things that are hard to study. Most of the studies are small. The length of dietary treatment may be lengthy, and it's unethical to withhold other potentially evidence-based treatments. They don't hold constant the impact of other interventions. And also, which outcome is the outcome related to diet? As I said in the prior slide, if you can control, if you can improve attention, might other symptoms look better? So that there are many dietary changes that may impact behavior. We don't have evidence at this point, but the fact that we as a society are interested in purchasing fortified foods, we have personal and societal views about the relationship of food and wellness. We see nutrition as having fewer side effects, and it's something that we as families can manage ourselves, that we can be in charge. And I think that as seminars like this and other ways of getting science out to the general population are really progressing, that you see what the basis of all therapies, including conventional therapies, are and how limited they are. So you are what you eat. Be attentive to what you eat. Use scientific evidence for decision-making about what limitations, as well as how to increase the variety of foods. Be sure to tell your clinicians what it is that your child is eating and what you're supplementing with, because as you saw, that some people really do have risk for deficiency disorders. And we all need to keep our minds open about the data that supports and refutes nutritional interventions, because it changes almost every day. There was just an article that was published looking at the nutritional content of gluten-free foods and how they actually may be less nutritionally complete than gluten-containing foods. These are some of Victor Linlar's original publications, and from the past 50 minutes, we saw that you are what you eat, at least at some level. And there probably are things that we will learn about in the next few years through research that will help us with managing behavior through diet at multiple levels, from the microbiome to the foods that we eat. I want to thank my colleagues who helped me with this research over the years, and especially to the families and children who inspire the research, and the parents who give me recipes to share with other families every day. So thank you very much, and I think that we will have some time for questions.
Hi, this is Vincent again. Thank you so much. We did get a number of questions in during the talk, so we'll try to answer as many as we can. Let's see, I'm just sorting through them here. Okay. Someone was asking about where you're located, so just as a reminder, Dr. Hyman is at the University of Rochester. Dr. Hyman, which clinic are you at specifically?
So it's in Rochester, New York. I'm at the Levine Autism Clinic.
Okay. Just scrolling through, a lot of these you've answered. Someone was asking about the form of vitamin A. Does it matter if it's palmitate versus beta-carotene?
So with the beta-carotene, which you get in natural substances, you can't overdose on. So you don't want the way dietitians will look at vitamin A, they look at retinol equivalents, and the product labeling will be changing to reflect that in the next few years. I think the take-home message is, with vitamin A, we generally are very cautious about giving high doses as supplements because hypervitaminosis A can give you irritability, it can decrease your appetite, it can give you some of the things that you're trying to treat. Usually it requires quite high levels, can give you headaches. So we would recommend that whatever product that you're using, that you stay within the recommended amounts and not not give too much. And you can eat as much vitamin A as you want in foods, because you just will urinate out what you don't need, so that you see, in general pediatrics, you see children who have slightly orange-tinged skin because they like squash and carrots, and that's actually perfectly safe.
Okay. In clinic, do you recommend any specific supplements or multivitamins?
So Americans take too many multivitamins, that we take lots of vitamins we don't need, that multivitamins give us more of what we're already eating. The children who are very selective eaters may need a multivitamin, but most kids don't need a multivitamin. What most kids do need is adequate calcium and vitamin D. And when you look at the ingredients on the bottle of vitamins that you got at the corner pharmacy, most of them don't have calcium, and the minimum amount of vitamin D that children need is 600 international units a day. Pregnant women need more. And what we do is take a dietary history, and for children at risk, we have them see a registered dietitian so that we can supplement them more specifically. But you can't take away food groups with impunity, and vitamin D is probably the nutrient that we were most likely to recommend.
Okay. Another question. Are you still there, Susan?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So someone is asking, do you see a lot of patients with IBS or reflux in the autism population?
So we are actively looking for GI disease. Many people have misquoted us saying that we eliminated people with GI disease from the GFCS diet study that we did, and we didn't eliminate people with GI disease. We didn't include anyone who has known celiac disease, and we tested for that, and we didn't include anyone who had positive allergy testing for wheat or milk. There is an increased rate of constipation among children, and again, most of the data is on children. We have no reason to believe it's going to change in adulthood. There's an increased rate of constipation, and there's a question of whether some food refusal may be related to reflux or eosinophilic esophagitis. I am unaware of any data that would suggest that there is an increased risk of inflammatory bowel disease, but people are actively looking at the immune environment in the gut in people with autism and how that may relate both to the microbiome or the bacteria that live in your gut, or some biologic factors related to what makes people autistic in the first place.
Okay. Well, we just have a question somewhat related to that about probiotics and if you recommend them or if there's any research into probiotics and autism.
So this is a really hot topic that I would recommend, Vincent, that you have a whole series on. The not to be an advertisement for some future session.
No.
The microbiome, the bacteria that live in your gut, what lives there is related to what you eat. So if you have a very limited diet with no fiber, you're going to have different bacteria that grow up and live there. And so your prebiotic, what you eat changes your microbiome, and then the supplements that you take may change your microbiome. The medicines you take may change your microbiome. Your mother's microbiome may affect what you have living in your gut. And one of the reasons why this is important is the microbiome, all these gazillion microorganisms are your partners, both in digestion and absorption of the nutrients that are your building blocks for neurotransmitters in your brain. So that there's an increasing area of research, not just in autism. Autism is just a poor cousin of a lot of the basic research that's being done of how this colony of germs can affect your mental health, your development, and general wellness. So it's a broad answer saying that the microbiome is an unappreciated area for intervention. And the statement, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is the state we're at right now with probiotics. That right now we know that when you take an antibiotic and you kill a lot of the germs in your gut, that if you take some of the commercial agents, probiotic agents, that you can repopulate your gut and the diarrhea will stop. We actually don't know if the common probiotic agents change things in a way that will change behavior or intestinal health, but certainly from an empiric, non-evidence-based fashion, when families report constipation, diarrhea, or GI pain, an over-the-counter probiotic is something they can be in control of and may provide some subjective help, but we don't have evidence to guide that practice.
Okay, that was helpful. And yes, thank you for the recommendation about a webinar on the microbiome. We definitely are interested in that. And please email us with any suggestions of speakers. So it is past 1 o'clock, so we do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we're going to end the webinar now. I know that we didn't get to answer everyone's questions, so we do apologize about that.